French President Emmanuel Macron once stood in front of cameras and, with a smirk, dismissed an entire continent in just a single remark. To him, Africa wasn't a living, breathing force of humanity. It was invisible, disposable, a place for resources, not people. That arrogance, uttered in public, struck like a knife. Millions felt humiliated. But what nobody knew was that this insult would light a fire that changed history. Because on that very same day, at that very same hour, something extraordinary happened in the heart of Africa. In Burkina Faso, the so-called kings of gold, Western mining executives, were dragged from their luxury suites in handcuffs. They weren't untouchable anymore. They weren't powerful anymore. They were just men in pajamas, stunned and powerless as the world's most fearless young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, made his move. And that begs the question, how could billion-dollar empires fall so fast on the very soil they had drained for decades? Here's where the story begins. August 10th, 5:00 a.m., Ouagadougou. The city was barely awake, the streets quiet, the first vendors setting up their stalls. But behind closed doors, shadows moved. Special forces, trained and armed, were already in position. In 7 luxury hotels, doors were about to be kicked open. Within minutes, men who had signed contracts worth billions would find themselves powerless before a force they thought didn't exist. Justice. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a random crackdown. This was planned to perfection. Every step, every name, every room had been mapped out months in advance. To ordinary people, the morning looked calm. To the mining industry, it was the apocalypse. One CEO tried to dial his private security. Another prepared his escape convoy for the airport. Yet both failed. The borders were sealed. The skies were closed. And the game they had played for 60 years, stealing from Africa without consequence, was suddenly over. But what triggered this dramatic sweep? Arrests don't happen in a vacuum. Behind those early morning raids was a secret investigation that had quietly rewritten the future of Burkina Faso. Now, let me ask you something. If this were America, if foreign corporations had stolen trillions from U.S. soil for decades, how would Americans react? Would you cheer if the CEOs responsible were dragged to justice? If you agree that what happened in Burkina Faso was more than justified, then drop your thoughts in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the truth only spreads when we share it. How could empires built on gold collapse in a single night? The answer lies not in the raids themselves, but in the months of silence that came before. Ibrahim Traoré had already been preparing his strike long before the first hotel door was kicked open. In secret, he assembled a task force of lawyers, financial analysts, and anti-corruption experts. Their mission was clear: follow the gold. For 6 months, no one outside that circle knew what was happening. They traced mining contracts line by line, demanded 10 years of corporate tax records, and even planted informants deep inside extraction sites. Drones hovered silently above remote gold fields, capturing images of trucks leaving under the cover of darkness. Satellite data confirmed what the task force already suspected. Something massive was being hidden. And then came the revelation. Over 60 years, foreign mining companies had pulled more than $600 billion worth of gold out of Burkina Faso's soil. Yet, only $20 billion had ever reached the national treasury. The rest? Gone. Vanished into offshore accounts, fake invoices, and secret bank transfers. That wasn't just theft. That was a slow-motion robbery of an entire nation's future. What's worse, many corporations were underreporting up to 80% of their production. Imagine digging 10 ounces of gold, but officially declaring only 1. 9 out of 10 ounces disappeared before it could ever benefit the people who lived above those mines. This wasn't mismanagement. It was organized plunder. Now, let's pause for a moment. From an American perspective, this kind of deception feels eerily familiar. Think about the Enron scandal, or the collapse of Lehman Brothers, corporations manipulating numbers while ordinary people lost everything. But here, the scale wasn't just financial. It was national survival. What Americans might recognize as corporate fraud was, for Burkina Faso, the difference between children in school or children in mines. And here's the twist that made Traoré act fast. His team uncovered not just fraud, but evidence of crimes against humanity. Forced displacement of villages. Children as young as 10 working in dark, toxic shafts. Cyanide waste deliberately dumped into rivers. It was more than corruption, it was cruelty written into spreadsheets. So, when the arrests came, they weren't just a show of strength. They were the inevitable eruption of months of evidence carefully built into an unbreakable case. Think about it. If this kind of investigation had exposed U.S. tech giants siphoning trillions out of America, what would people demand? Jail time? Nationalization? Or perhaps something even more radical? I want to hear your view. Comment below, and if you believe that corporate theft, anywhere in the world, should never go unpunished, then hit like, share this story, and subscribe. Because what comes next will shake the world even harder. August 10th, 5:00 a.m. The capital was quiet, almost asleep. Street vendors set up their stalls, unaware that just blocks away, history was breaking into hotel rooms. At 7 different luxury hotels across Ouagadougou, doors shook under the weight of battering rams. Elite special forces stormed in, moving with precision. Within minutes, some of the most powerful men in the global mining industry were in handcuffs. Victor Pro, the billionaire head of Goldmax Corporation, tried to call his private guards. Too late. The entire building was already locked down. He was dragged out of bed, still in silk pajamas, shouting into a phone that no longer had a signal. Across town, Jean-Claude Dubois, CEO of Western Gold, was racing toward the airport. His private jet was fueled and waiting, but the skies had been shut down. Burkina Faso's airspace was sealed by presidential order. His convoy never even reached the runway. Meanwhile, Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources was caught in the middle of a crime. In his hotel conference room, laptop open, he was wiring millions of dollars overseas in a last-minute escape attempt. That very laptop, still warm, still glowing with bank transfers, became a key piece of evidence in the trials that would follow. This was not chaos. It was a masterpiece of coordination. Months of surveillance, intelligence reports, and airtight planning had led to a night where men who thought themselves untouchable discovered they were not kings, but fugitives. And here's a detail that stunned even seasoned observers. None of them saw it coming. Not one leak, not one whisper had reached the ears of these billionaires. For the first time in decades, the game was being played against them, and they were losing. Now step into this moment as an American viewer. Imagine Wall Street titans, CEOs of Goldman Sachs, Exxon, or Facebook, being yanked from penthouses by special forces, exposed for crimes against an entire nation. Would the world cheer, or would it panic? How much power would ordinary Americans feel if justice was finally served at that level? What happened that night in Ouagadougou was more than arrests. It was humiliation on a global stage. The images of billionaires in handcuffs sent shockwaves through boardrooms in Paris, London, Toronto, and Sydney. The message was clear. Africa was no longer playing by colonial rules, and yet this was only Act 1. Because what came next wasn't just about police raids. It was about the evidence, the secrets, and the documents that proved decades of theft. That's when the real war began. The arrests shocked the world, but the documents, those were the real earthquake. Traoré's task force didn't just storm hotel rooms. They stormed vaults of data, years of financial records, thousands of pages of contracts, and what they uncovered painted a picture darker than anyone dared to imagine. Take Goldmax Corporation. In 2020 alone, the company extracted more than $600 million worth of gold from just one site, the Tapoco mine. Yet, on paper, they declared only $60 million. How? By reporting just a fraction of their real production. 10 tons of gold dug each day, officially only 1. The other 9 vanished, smuggled through back channels, laundered across borders, hidden in offshore accounts. Western gold mining had its own trick: fake invoices. Gold bars worth $70,000 each were sold on paper for $20,000. The difference, untaxed and untraceable, was quietly wired into accounts in Geneva and the Cayman Islands. To the world, it looked like business. To Burkina Faso, it was theft on an industrial scale. And then there was Pacific Resources. Their fraud was so brazen it bordered on grotesque. They inflated workers' salaries tenfold on paper, claimed those as expenses, and pocketed the difference. In reality, miners were earning starvation wages. But on balance sheets, it looked like the company was losing money. That loss turned into profit when tax bills shrank to nothing. But the evidence went beyond fraud. Traoré's investigators found proof of crimes that cut deeper. Entire villages bulldozed for new mining licenses, forests erased, rivers poisoned with cyanide waste. Thousands of people displaced, tens of thousands left without homes, farmland, or clean water. One leaked memo from Pacific Resources instructed, "Dump waste directly into the river. Locals won't notice. They don't live long anyway." Another internal email from Goldmax executives mocked the Burkinabe people as stupid natives who will dance for dollars. These weren't just numbers. These were confessions, written in the corporation's own words. Now, think about it from an American point of view. Imagine finding leaked emails from Silicon Valley CEOs laughing at American workers, calling them expendable, poisoning rivers in Ohio, or forcing children into sweatshops. Outrage would explode across the United States. So why should the crimes committed in Africa be treated any differently? And here's the twist. These weren't isolated cases. The bribes ran deep, touching ministers, lawmakers, even cabinet members. A $60 million bribe had been paid to cut tax rates in half. Another $150 million had secured licenses on land where 50,000 villagers lived. Families were uprooted, graves desecrated, communities erased, all for gold. The task force had built something more powerful than arrests. They had built a legal time bomb, one that would explode not just in Burkina Faso, but across the global mining industry. And explode it did, inside a courtroom that would soon put the richest men on earth face to face with the poorest people they had robbed. The raids were spectacular, but the real battle began in court. For the first time in modern African history, justice would not be outsourced to Paris, The Hague, or Washington. It would be delivered on African soil under African judges without Western lobbyists whispering in the background. A special independent tribunal was created. 7 judges chosen for their incorruptibility. 3 from Africa, 2 from Asia, 2 from Latin America. Not a single Western government had a seat at the table. The message was unmistakable. This trial would not be another show manipulated from abroad. It would be a reckoning. On the first day, the courtroom overflowed. Villagers traveled for days to witness history. Miners with scarred lungs, farmers who had lost their fields, mothers who had lost children, all packed into the gallery. The atmosphere was electric. When the prosecutor stood to read the charges, silence fell like a weight. Victor Pro of Goldmax faced 20 counts: tax evasion, bribery, land theft, environmental destruction, forced displacement. Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold, 17 counts including child labor. Children as young as 12 forced underground for 16-hour shifts, many dead before 15. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, charged with mass poisoning after cyanide runoff from his mines killed thousands downstream. Then came the witnesses. A 64-year-old miner, Amadou Sawad, coughed as he spoke. "For 50 years I pulled gold from the ground. Europe grew rich from my sweat. My children cannot even afford to go to school." The courtroom was silent until his words cracked into tears. A 70-year-old woman, Miriam, told of her village bulldozed in one night. "They destroyed everything for $100. My family's graves, my home, my life, all gone." The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was testimony against half a century of abuse. And then, a bombshell. From laptops seized during the raids, investigators produced internal corporate emails. In one, Goldmax executives sneered, "These stupid natives will do anything for a few million. They dance for dollars." Another, from Pacific Resources, read, "Child labor is cheaper. 10 kids for the price of 1 adult, and they never complain." The room gasped. Some spectators shouted. One judge slammed his gavel until silence returned. Even seasoned journalists admitted they had never seen such raw contempt for human life laid bare in black and white. Now, let's switch lenses. Imagine leaked documents in America showing Fortune 500 CEOs mocking citizens as expendable or bragging about exploiting children in mines. Would Americans tolerate it? Would shareholders defend it? Or would the fury of public opinion tear those corporations apart overnight? This trial wasn't just Burkina Faso versus a few CEOs. It was Africa versus 500 years of theft. Traoré himself sat in the front row, watching, his expression steady but his hands trembling when those emails were read. And when he finally rose to speak, his words cut deep. "Now you see what they think of us. To them, we are disposable, but that ends today." The verdict was still weeks away, but the world already understood. The game had changed forever. 6 months after the arrests, the verdicts finally arrived. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, air heavy with tension. Every eye fixed on the panel of judges, every breath held as history prepared to speak. The first name echoed through the chamber. Victor Pro, CEO of Goldmax Corporation. 40 years in prison, a $10 billion fine. Gasps filled the room. The once untouchable billionaire who had flown in private jets now faced decades behind bars in a sweltering Burkina Faso prison. Next came Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold. 35 years in prison, $8 billion penalty. His crimes included child labor, forced displacement, and tax fraud. Mothers in the gallery wept openly, not for him, but because justice had finally come for the children who never came home from the mines. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources was sentenced to life in prison for mass poisoning. His mine's cyanide waste had killed more than 3,000 villagers. Robert McKenzie of Continental Gold, 31 years for uprooting entire communities. James Harrison of African Minerals, 50 years for deadly child labor practices. Peter Williams of Global Mining Co-op, 40 years for catastrophic environmental destruction. And finally, David Anderson of Summit Resources, life without parole for financing and arming militant groups. Every single one guilty. But the real twist came next. The court didn't stop at prison sentences. Judges announced that all assets, yachts, mansions, private jets, offshore accounts, even priceless art collections, would be seized, liquidated, and transferred directly to victims' families. Not to governments, not to corporations. Directly to the people. In the gallery, silence broke into cheers. Tears streamed down faces. For once, restitution wasn't a vague promise. It was cash in hand, land restored, homes rebuilt. Generations who had been robbed were finally being repaid. Now imagine this scene through an American lens. Think about Enron's executives, Lehman Brothers bankers, or Purdue Pharma's opioid kings. They faced fines, yes, but did ordinary victims ever see billions returned to them directly? Did families destroyed by opioids or collapsed pensions get full justice? No, they got settlements, scraps, PR campaigns. Imagine if U.S. courts had gone as far as Burkina Faso's, seizing every yacht, every villa, every secret account and giving it straight to victims. Would Americans have trusted the system more? Or would the word justice finally mean something real? This is why the world couldn't agree on how to frame Traoré. In Africa, he was hailed as a liberator, the man who put 500 years of colonial theft on trial. But in Western media, headlines painted him as a dictator, a reckless populist, a strongman drunk on power. President Biden threatened sanctions. Emmanuel Macron snarled, "You'll pay for this. You don't touch our investors." Traoré's reply was ice cold. "Say colonizers, not investors. Real investors are welcome. Thieves in suits, no more." The contrast was stark. To Burkinabe villagers, he was a hero. To foreign boardrooms, a nightmare. To neutral observers, perhaps both at once. And that contradiction, that clash of narratives, was exactly what pushed the story into headlines around the globe. Was this justice or revenge? Liberation or tyranny? The debate raged on, but one fact remained undeniable. The CEOs were stripped, forgotten, and finished. And while they sat in overcrowded prisons, Burkina Faso was already moving to its next chapter, a chapter that would turn poverty into prosperity. When the verdicts were read and the assets seized, something extraordinary happened. Burkina Faso did not collapse under Western pressure, as many pundits predicted. Instead, the nation surged forward with a transformation so rapid, so visible, that even skeptics struggled to deny it. Within 1 year, the country's national income had tripled, an unprecedented 300% growth. Gold revenues, once siphoned off to Paris, London, and Toronto, now flowed directly into the state treasury. For the first time in living memory, the wealth of the soil stayed where it was dug. Half of this revenue was earmarked for the people. Over 200 new schools were built. More than 100 hospitals opened their doors. 8,000 kilometers of paved roads connected villages that had been isolated for generations. Electricity reached over 1,000 rural communities. Clean water flowed into towns that had never seen running taps. Poverty rates plummeted. And it wasn't just numbers, it was life itself. In villages once hollowed out by displacement, families returned home, schools replaced toxic pits, clinics replaced despair. Children who had once labored underground now played football barefoot in open fields, books in their hands instead of shovels. Mothers wept, not from hunger, but from relief. Elders raised their fists in pride as their grandchildren studied by electric light for the first time. Worker salaries skyrocketed. Miners who once earned $40 a month now made over $700. Fatal accidents dropped to zero after safety standards were enforced. Child labor was banned outright, forever. For many, it felt like a renaissance. But here's the twist. The ripple didn't stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Inspired by Traoré's defiance, neighboring nations began to act. In Mali, 5 mining CEOs were arrested under similar charges. Guinea nationalized its bauxite mines. Niger reclaimed control of its uranium deposits. One after another, African nations tore up exploitative contracts signed under colonial shadows. Western investors panicked. Stocks of major mining corporations crashed overnight. Billions in shareholder value evaporated. Emergency meetings were held in Brussels, Washington, and Paris. The old system of extraction was unraveling in real time. From an American perspective, the sight was almost surreal. For decades, Africa had been framed as a place of chaos, dependence, and crisis. Yet here was Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country, setting an example of accountability, prosperity, and self-determination. The question many Americans quietly asked was, why hasn't this happened at home? If corporations can be held accountable in Ouagadougou, why not in New York or Los Angeles? This was no longer just Burkina Faso's story. It was Africa's awakening, a movement spreading across borders, shaking boardrooms in Europe, and forcing uncomfortable questions in Washington. And still, one question lingered. How would the world's most powerful nations react to a continent rewriting the rules of wealth and justice? The victories in court, the billions reclaimed, the schools and hospitals rising from the ground, none of it went unnoticed. The West was furious. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron slammed his fist on the podium. "You'll pay for this. You don't get to touch our investors." His words dripped with rage, but in Africa they rang hollow, because for the first time, Africans were not afraid. In Washington, President Joe Biden threatened sanctions and the suspension of U.S. aid. Traoré responded with a smirk. "Which aid? The $200 million you give each year? We will make $20 billion from our own gold. Keep your aid. Give it to your puppet states." The chamber erupted with applause when those words echoed through Burkina Faso's National Assembly. Brussels convened an emergency session. European leaders called Traoré reckless, a populist, a dangerous precedent. And yet, behind closed doors, some admitted what they feared most. If Burkina Faso could do it, so could Mali, Guinea, Niger, Congo. The entire neocolonial system was trembling. Western media doubled down, labeling Traoré a dictator. Editorials painted him as Africa's next strongman, a nationalist playing with fire. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the picture was very different. Hundreds of thousands filled the squares, waving flags, chanting, "Our gold is ours." Farmers marched alongside miners, students alongside elders. For the first time, the nation moved as one. And then came Traoré's speech, the one that would define his legacy. Standing before the courthouse steps, he declared, "Today, we did not just put 7 men on trial. We put 500 years of colonial theft on trial. And today, we won. Our land, our gold, our future belong to us." The words shot across Africa like lightning. In Latin America, leaders spoke of Bolivia's lithium and Venezuela's oil. In Asia, whispers spread of rare earths long exploited by foreign corporations. It was as if a sleeping world had suddenly opened its eyes. But here is the controversy that keeps the debate alive. Was this true justice or revenge? Was Traoré defending sovereignty or consolidating power? To Africans in the streets, he was a liberator. To European investors, a nightmare. To Americans, perhaps a paradox. A man who delivered the justice Wall Street never faced, yet one who wielded power with iron hands. And that is where history leaves us, with a continent awakening and a world divided. But one truth is undeniable. Africa will never be the same. Children no longer cough in mines. They chase soccer balls under blue skies. Workers no longer scrape by. They build homes, send their kids to school, walk with dignity. And foreign corporations no longer laugh in secret emails because their time has ended. As Traoré said, "The age of exploitation is over. Africa's resources belong to its people." If you believe this awakening matters, if you think justice should echo beyond Burkina Faso, then let your voice be heard. Comment below. Share this story, subscribe, because the truth only spreads when people like you carry it forward. Africa is awake now, and this time no one will strip its treasures away.